Bliss Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/blissandgrit.
Hello, beautifuls. You are listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're having conversations about the awakening spiritual path, including themes like embodiment, healing, and being human. Today, inspired by the teachings of AH Almaas, we're discussing a concept he calls basic trust. Basic trust is like the implicit sense that we're connected, safe, held, and supported by life. What really fascinated us about this concept is the revelation that once trust gets ruptured, spiritual aspirations such as surrender, acceptance, or letting go can feel really out of reach or just simply effortful. Also, how much or how little basic trust you have can affect the quality and experience of your spiritual awakening journey. In this conversation, we explore, of course, our perspectives on basic trust, as well as get into Almaas's definition and how basic trust is fed, ruptured, and ultimately how we heal. If you're enjoying the show, we would love it if you would support us, and there's a few ways you can do that. First, it would be so appreciated if you would go ahead and leave a review for us, preferably on iTunes, or you can also go to our Facebook page, which is Bliss and Grit. It's so helpful in getting people to find us, and we just love to see what's happening for all of you. You can also head over to blissandgrit.com and you can buy some of our swag, or you can get our weekly digest that comes out every Friday. And if you want to find out more about becoming a supporting member, which is truly amazing, please go over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/blissandgrit. One last thing before we head into the conversation, just in case you're new to the show, Brooke and I do curse, and I do think it happened quite a few times this episode. So if you're in mixed company, you may want to pop some headphones in. Okay, everyone, here we go. Hello, darling Brooke.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing good today, darling. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I was just wrestling with my computer, but otherwise I'm doing great. We worked it out.
We did, didn't we? Somehow, again. Well, as this is our second episode back from break, I think it would be delightful to pick up on a topic we began to touch on last week, actually, right?
Mm-hmm. I would say so.
We talked about it a little bit. Last week's episode was funny because here we are talking about awakening in this really, this is what we're going to be talking about kind of way. And afterwards I was laughing. I'm like, I'm not even sure how many people didn't know that or did know that. I don't know if that was a revelation just for us or for everyone.
Sure. Or even that it's so firm, like, yes, this is, I'm like, well, it kind of encompasses everything. It doesn't need to be so like
explicit.
Yeah.
Well, whatever. We needed to do it, obviously, for us. And we did it wholly and perfectly, because how do you talk about these things? So I want to build upon something, though, and it sort of relates to that, actually. So today we're going to be exploring a topic called basic trust. It's a topic written about and spoken about by a teacher named AH Almaas, who we will share on our website in the show notes. And I think it's really relevant, important, enlightening for me, for my clients, I imagine will be for all of you. And he writes about it in particular in reference to awakening. So what he's saying is all humans are on an awakening journey to some extent, conscious or unconscious. And that this quality that he's describing as basic trust sort of implies how you will go through this journey. In other words, the more trust you have, the easier the unfolding will be as you come to awaken to your true self. And the less you have, the more gritty it might be, the more chafy it might be as you keep having these things come into your path. So I think this concept says a lot about our human experience. I think it says a lot about our healing experience. And I think it also says something about what awakening may be like for us. So today we're going to do something, we often do this. We read quotes, things that stimulated our thought process or our healing process. But today I'm going to on and off read quite a bit from his book. It's called Facets of Unity, just because this concept of trust is pretty deep. It's pretty specific. And he says it so well. Why should we say it ourselves? And we'll just read from it. And then Brooke and I will share our experience or thoughts. You ready, Brooke?
I'm so ready.
Okay. Me too. Let's do it. Okay. So let me begin by sharing a definition of sorts of basic trust. And it'll be a little bit long. Everybody just relax, take a breath, close your eyes, and see if you can take this in and relate with it. So basic trust is an unspoken, implicit trust that what is optimal will happen. The sense that whatever happens will ultimately be fine. It is the confidence that reality is ultimately good, that nature, the universe, and all that exists are of their very nature good and trustworthy, that what happens is the best that can happen. Basic trust is a non-conceptual confidence in the goodness of the universe, an unquestioned implicit trust that there's something about the universe and human nature and life that's inherently and fundamentally good, loving, and wishing us the best. With basic trust, you feel in your bones that you are and will be okay, even if the events at the moment are disappointing or painful, or even completely disastrous. Consequently, you live your life in such a way that you naturally jump into the abyss without even conceptualizing that you will be okay, since you have the implicit trust or sense that the universe will take care of you. I'm going to read one last little bit of this. Basic trust is the soul's way of attuning to a fundamental law of reality. The fact that our sense of existing as a separate and isolated entity is false. That our ego experience of isolation and helplessness is an illusion based on identification with the world of physical manifestation. Knowing that we are all part of one reality means that our true nature is not defined by ego experience or the physical body and cannot be fundamentally hurt or destroyed. I think that last part is really important because it sort of defines the context of basic trust. We're not just talking about trust that things will go the way I want them to go. We're not just trusting that our feelings won't get hurt or even that our physical form won't get hurt. So he's really outlining the context by which this trust exists. It's the trust of the soul that knows we are fundamentally a part of the universe. Inextricably, we're made up of the fabric of the universe, and that the soul goes on, right? So we're talking about a soul level trust. Now, part of why I thought this was really important or interesting to share is in other parts of the book, he goes on to say that these wonderful spiritual aspirations that you and I both have, and I know many of our listeners have, like trusting the universe, surrendering to life, going with the flow, accepting, that all of these things naturally arise without effort when basic trust is present. But without basic trust, often seem to be things we're grasping at, and often things that are motivated by the ego structure, which can't surrender to life, can't trust, because its fundamental nature is formed without basic trust. And we can talk more about that, the ego and the soul and all of these things. So I thought this is really interesting because as we go, we can describe how basic trust unfolds and why most of us don't have it, why it's relevant in our healing journey to look at it, but also because, we could be so hard on ourselves. Like, why aren't I just surrendering already? And like, why can't I trust life? And I think this is a really important aspect to bring in. Like, hey, life's been really fucking hard for some of us. And there's been a lot of pain, and there's a lot of pain that we see around us and all of these different things. And this aspect of not knowing that we're inextricably a part of life and that we can trust the benevolence that is in your bones, not a concept, but like so deep down, you never even think about it. This is a part of why we struggle with these beautiful spiritual aspirations that we're drawn towards. So let's dive in a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I hear all the same words that all the rest of us hear on the path, which are useful pointers, but if you have no context for what they are experientially, it's challenging. And so surrender. I mean, you and I, we have a t-shirt that we sell, Trust Your Life, right? Like, so this is something that's really important to us. And it is a lived ongoing inquiry, right? That phrase is so important to us because it's such a crucial inquiry for each of us. And such a good and beautiful and useful pointer on the path. And I would say that there's something deepening in me, and in large part because you and I have brought this up as like a topic, something to inquire about in real time on the show. So I've spent a lot of time in the past 6 months to a year with the word surrender as an inquiry. I don't understand this word to a certain degree. Like, of course, I know what the textbook, dictionary definition is, but I notice that I can't, it's not an action I can decide to have and choose cognitively and then follow through on or not. It's not, am I doing a good job surrendering or a bad job surrendering? And it's not the bypass ideas of like, become the slow blinker, right? Just chill out, or just accept that you're going to be laying around in the muck and that's how life goes. Like we can see all these different variations of it. And so it's been interesting to live and to watch with awareness internally in myself, because it's the, I can't go to there. There's this longing to know what that means experientially, and quote unquote inability or foreignness. It's like this foreign planet. And so when you brought up basic trust in the last week, it just keeps deepening. Again, epiphanies are always so dumb when you say them with words, but when you experience them, they are profound truths and life altering. And it's like, oh my God, of course I can't go to there. There's this foundational ingredient missing of basic trust. And then once I kind of got that on an experiential level, I was reminded of an experience I had 2 years ago. So when I was really in it with Dark Night of the Soul, there was a period of time, people who've listened to the show before have heard me talk about this, but there was a period of time where if I wasn't, like, I could be very functional, high functioning for my clients at work, totally normal, feel totally normal. I wasn't putting on a happy face, and I could be very functional, happy, totally normal in parenting. But when I wasn't playing one of those two actions out in my life, I was pretty much on bed rest. And sometimes when I was with clients or parenting, I would kind of get the information, and it was actually like a physical sensation that would get so big in my system that I had to go like lay down in a room. So there was one night where I had a full night of clients booked, and I saw 3 of them. And then I got the urgent message in my system, for lack of a better way of describing it, of like, you have to cancel your last clients and go home. And I did. It wasn't optional. Even though when you're self-employed, you always think about the money part. When you're self-employed and you have money stories. But but I was like, it's just not optional. So I went home. I was home alone because my son was still where he was supposed to be for the next 3 hours of childcare. And I was told to lay down on the floor, internal information was provided. And I laid down, and then I was taken through this video tour. I often get video tours. All of these words are so imperfect for what I'm trying to describe. But if I could put words to what I saw, it was that it was almost like God was the needle and I was the thread. So I was threaded through this sewing needle of God. And it was showing me stitching through the tapestry of my last 6 years or something. And it was showing me all the hard parts, which had involved a lot of hard parts, like a business that failed, real financial hardship, like maybe facing bankruptcy, divorce, becoming a new parent and not coping particularly well with that, an abusive relationship after my divorce, and it just showed me all of these. It was a very painful period of my life. And what it was conveying, this movie was, I could see how the needle would go up and through. So God and me going up and through very painful experience. And then it would sew down next through the fabric. And I could see how I was beautifully and profoundly transformed by each of those experiences. That first of all, I survived them. They're not still happening. Like in this moment, laying on the floor, that's not happening. Actually, the reality of my actual life, other than the fact that I'm in this dark night, is that it's pretty content. Like it's really set up in a very supportive, contented way. There's a lot of health, robust health in my life. And then it would show me how it would go up through another one of those very painful experiences and then go back down in the sense that I saw that I deepened into an even much more rich version of myself. And it's kind of like if you are an auntie or an uncle and you don't see your niece or nephew except like once or twice a year. And when you see them, you're like, oh my God, you've grown so much. And the parents don't notice because the parents are with them every day. So it was kind of showing me this, like, you're with yourself every moment of every day. So like, let's take a little bit of a pause while you're still alive and have a little life review moment. And I could see how immature, how selfish, and I don't mean these things in self-deprecating way. Actually, there was so much love and affection for that person too. It wasn't like, I'm not like her anymore. It was like so much love and affection for her, but man, was she sleepwalking. And then with each piercing through this painful experience, I would go down and deepen, and I just wasn't as shallow. I wasn't as unconscious. I was just a much richer, more mature version of myself. And like, in some ways we can describe these kinds of experiences. And it's like, well, when's God going to give me my movie? My life review showing when I'm in the midst of dark night. And, so I'm just a little hesitant to point out I had this profound moment of grace, but at the same time that was given to me. And I choose to do public facing work about this process. So I'm passing it on because it was this really beautiful screening of life review of a period of very painful years. And that I was kind of reminded of it in this moment in this week as like, oh, right. Like that's basic trust, because there's such a persistent drive in us when we're ego identified, which most of us are most of the time. And we're, maturing and evolving out of that at different rates. But there's such a persistent belief that we should like what's happening in our lives all the time, or what's happening in the world all the time. And that things should go the way we want them to go.
Or think they should go. And that we can kind of outsmart God and like plan this journey in the way that like, can I just feel awesome all the time, or can I? And so basic trust isn't basic trust that at some point I will have improved myself enough that God will only give me the treats. That's not basic trust. Basic trust is, and man, like I feel like this one, the bottom keeps dropping out of it, and it keeps the depths that I can go with this. I think is
just eternal, that it's going to keep showing me just how much it's like, wow, it's all really, really, really a deepening. And I don't have to like it, and I don't have to agree with it, and I don't have to lie back and take it. None of those things are true. But sometimes, or for some people, frequently, you can really see that there is an intelligence and a force of love moving through your life, sewing the needle through the, needle and thread through the fabric of your life in a way that provides, my access now to love and contentment and fulfillment are things that I just didn't have before. And so I don't mean it in this cheery story of like, isn't it awesome that we suffer? No, it hurts that we suffer. Also, it just seems to be what we're doing here. Like, I can't argue with that. It just seems to be what's happening. And so is it possible? Can we live the inquiry? Is it possible to trust not just that, not just the pain, but also the goodness and exactly how it's delivered, exactly the rhythms of it, the precision of it, the targeted nature exactly to what each of us needs to be more conscious? And that's a profound letting go. That's a profound surrender, because it basically experiences. It's, even when it's horrific, it's all good here. There is a deepening.
Right. It's huge though. That's why I think, you said so much that was good. There's so many things we can touch on, but that's why I think the context of holding this in the ultimate dimension of reality is very important. The way that AH Almaas is bringing forward this topic is that basic trust is an aspect of the soul. It's what the soul does. And I want to read a quote after about ego, but egos ultimately develop in reaction to this loss of trust, right? So when you put it in the ultimate dimension of reality, we're trusting that there's a rhyme or reason in a very different way, because it's not based on time. It's not linear. It's not just based on this body and what it's endured. It's not just based on this personality structure of Vanessa and what she's endured. So it's this extremely large view. Now, the moments like that moment you had where that large view comes into the foreground of your experience as, of course, this is life, then naturally basic trust has a different way of taking shape. But when we're in the confines of our ego structure, which, as you said, for most of us is day to day, it almost makes no sense.
It totally makes no sense. And it's infuriating.
Yeah, it's fucking, it's just painful. It just doesn't make sense. And I think we can talk more about that. So I used to have a way of saying, I'd work with clients. So I'm always exploring human nature. And I had a wish that if people had a really tough childhood, like they went through whatever really tough experiences they went through, whatever was creating their own version of suffering. My wish was, like, on the other end, it got easier, okay, like you did the hard stuff. Now it gets easy. And it's a naive wish, but a wish nonetheless, because it's not what you saw to be true. A lot of times, if people endured a certain level of suffering, a certain kind of suffering, especially it seems the kind of suffering that turns you against yourself, consciously or unconsciously, that if you endured a certain kind of suffering, as you went through your adulthood, that suffering still seemed to be there in some form, whether it was lack of trust in loving relationships, or whether it was a lack of belief in your gifts, or a lack of self-love, or a lack of belief in abundance, whatever it was still showing up in this mirror of life. And I thought, how profoundly unfair, right? How profoundly unfair that people suffer so much and then they go on to suffer so much. Mm-hmm. Right. Now, of course, that's only one view of reality. It supposes that there are a bunch of people out there not suffering and had it easy and good. And on a relative spectrum, it is true. Though I know people in very privileged positions who seem to be suffering quite a bit inside of their own being regardless. But still, relatively, it is true. But this concept sort of wove that all together for me. Like, of course, because the way that basic trust is formed, at least we're working with this one teacher's teaching, is by being held in a good, supportive, beautiful environment when you were raised in your earliest, most formative phase of life. Environment mostly implies your immediate family, but not only. It's your culture. It's the ecosystem that you're raised in. So, of course, if you had a difficult entry into this life, this trust gets ruptured. And a lot of what we then experience as internal difficulty is a reflection of this rupture with the trust in life and also with ourselves. Because the more that that trust is ruptured, ultimately, the farther we move from ourselves. If we can't trust that life is unfolding perfectly, then we think we better do something, right? Like then the pressure's on me. So I got to figure it out. So then I try to figure it out, but I'm figuring it out from this perspective of having ruptured with myself and with life itself from my ultimate reality. So of course things start to go haywire. So to me, I think this was, understanding this helped me understand a little more of my journey. And it gave me more love and compassion, as understanding ultimately does, for why this can feel so difficult for so many of us. Like surrender, I can fucking surrender. Like that shit.
To this shit show?
Yeah, like there's no intelligence here. I mean, if this is intelligence, I don't want it, right? That's how it feels from the perspective of ego.
Many conversations on the phone where we basically just called each other to say, if this is loving intelligence, fuck this place.
Yeah, bullshit, right? I'm going to create a different universe then, because this is totally unintelligent as far as I can tell, right? From that perspective. So maybe we can get a little bit into ego and trust just to shed some further light on this, and then ultimately into his experience of how basic trust is formed. Yeah. And it's cool. I hope I remember at some point to mark how the healing happens. So make sure we talk about, how one goes about healing basic trust. Okay?
You mean repairing the capacity for it?
Yeah, repairing that, just so we don't forget, because that seems to be real important.
Yeah, it would be nice to have a little touch in on that.
Yeah, so it's not just a bummer. Okay, so the disturbance of basic trust is a significant factor in ego development, because the perspective of ego is diametrically opposed to the sense of basic trust. The ego's perspective arises out of a lack of this trust. It is based on distrust, on paranoia, on fear, on the conviction that you're not going to be adequately taken care of, and that the universe is not there to hold and take care of you in the ways you need. This conviction causes you to believe that you have to engage in all kinds of manipulations and games to get your needs met and to make things work out. Basic trust is the implicit confidence in reality that results from experiencing this dimension of being, this goodness, this light of the soul. It is the trust that even if you fall, you will be held. If you let go, things will be okay. If you let yourself not know, you will be guided. If you do not manipulate, you will be taken care of in a way that's appropriate for you. So basically, and there's so much more we can say, the ego structures based on these experiences in early childhood that leave an imprint on the soul of a lack of holding, leading to a loss of contact with the loving and supportive dimension of being. Repeated experiences of physical and or emotional pain, as well as impingements from or neglect by the environment, lead the soul to react in an attempt to bring the holding about. The soul experiences itself as cut off, alone, separate, isolated, and it feels that it has to fend for itself and help itself in order to survive. The distrust that is fundamental to the ego perspective is based on not experiencing the goodness of the universe. So ultimately, a good holding environment, that's what he's talking about, which is a psychological concept as well. They talk about a kind of good enough mother, a good enough environment, or they talk about a holding environment. Is an environment that's needed for the human soul to grow and develop into what she can become. It needs to provide a sense of safety and security, the sense that you are and can count on being taken care of. Your soul needs an environment that is dependable, consistent, attuned to your needs, and that provides for you in a way that is empathic to those needs. Okay.
Bummersville has arrived.
Right. How many of us had a holding environment? I think what's really interesting about the way that he describes it is we understand there's like capital T trauma. Okay, so capital T trauma, whether we're talking about different forms of abuse that can take place in your early childhood, different forms of violation by your culture, by your family, right? If we're talking about racism or misogynism, or we're talking about actual violations by people who are close to you, we know capital T trauma does not serve as a good holding environment for the development and unfolding of safety, security, the sense that everything's okay. But for many people who are listening and are sensitive souls, are empaths, it really just takes someone not being dependable, consistent, attuned to your needs and providing for you in a way that's empathic to those needs for you to experience this rupture, which is important to say because I remember when I first went into therapy, and my childhood was no fucking picnic, no doubt. There's a lot of ancestral lineage trauma being passed down and passed down. But it certainly wasn't the worst on a spectrum, right? So when I first started going to therapy, I thought, okay, big baby, what are you crying about, right? Like your life is so, you shouldn't complain, you weren't locked in a closet. And that was, my perspective. And I think in part it's because of this lack of understanding about what a human needs to flourish in their soul and how very painful it can be just simply not to have empathic attunements to who you really are. And then the result of that being, you think you have to do something to get it. So you start to move away from your spontaneous nature in an attempt to perform, manipulate, strategize, do, strive, get. I mean, it's ultimately the moving away from trust in yourself and a sense of love and a sense of connectivity to everything to becoming this isolated identity that is alone against the universe, trying desperately to figure out how to get all of your basic needs met, like love and validation and kindness. And so that alone, this kind of rupture is agony, right? And the more aware you are of it, the more you're aware of the agony of it, which is what I think happens to a lot of empathic, sensitive souls, is they're just so aware. It only takes a little bit of movement away from your natural self for you to feel the splintering and the pain of the splintering. I don't suppose we're meant to be away from our natural selves, even though it seems like the whole game of life, because even he acknowledges, like, we all have an ego. Like, it happens to all of us. There's some rupture of basic trust for all of us, and there's also some sense of basic trust for all of us. He says if you're on the spiritual path, you already have it to a certain degree, maybe more than the average person, maybe. If you wake up in the morning, you already have some sense of basic trust. So everyone's got some sense of basic trust, and everyone's got some ego. But how crystallized it is into your identity and how crystallized it is into your sense of this is how life works, this is the universe for you, that depends on this earliest phase of your holding environment. So I think that's huge for me to understand in terms of bringing compassion and love and patience into the journey, and also to pointing me towards how to heal in a way that's a little clearer, right? Because a lot of times we can notice, for lack of a better way of saying it, what the problem is, but we can't sense the way through. So we keep saying like, okay, you know, why can't I just surrender by now? Like, what's up? I have moments of it. I do it 5% of the time, and this, I think, gives us something to point ourselves towards.
Yeah. Because the ego pattern is, why can't I? I guess I'll try to, or I should X better, or I shouldn't do so much of whatever. So we can, of course, do that with this process as well, which is exactly what holds the inability to trust life and to surrender in place.
And it's
so funny.
Pain. It's the original pain. And it reminds me of what Locke Kelly spoke about, or Matt Kahn in his own language spoke about. But Locke Kelly, you know, looking at the ego or the awake awareness, like what they're basically saying is the ego can't surrender. The ego can't trust because it's formed based on this idea that one can't trust.
Yeah.
Right. So we're not going to get it by trying to muscle ourselves into a certain experience. We're going to get it by bringing awareness to the whole pattern. And we can talk more about this as we go. And then allowing the soul to come into the foreground. Yeah.
And I can't emphasize enough how funny over and over and over again it is when experiences of genuine surrender and genuine trust arise. There's always right on its heels this sensation of like, oh, I guess there's nothing for me to do here. Because if the ego is always manhandling its way through life, and you have these moments of it just not being at all relevant to the experience you're having in that moment, I can't tell you how endlessly shocking and surprising it always feels to me to be like, oh, the name of the game is just like contentment. And the name of the game is just, I experience whatever I'm actually experiencing in the moment it's happening, whether that's grief, joy, whatever it is. And there's always this feel, and it's totally like you took the ball away from the ego on the playground, and it's like, but what do I do? Just sit here in the grass? And it's like, yeah, sure. Kind of.
Well, because it means like no hope. Mm-hmm. Like to that particular operating system, if I say to you, there's nothing for you to do here, it's like, so then it's hopeless.
Right. Which I think is why Pema Chodron and many other people, and Buddhist teachers in particular, point to the wisdom and the joy of hopelessness. But of course that gets confused and contorted. And it's like, and you see a lot of your Buddhist practitioners walking around like, yeah, it just feels good to feel like this. And it's like, I don't think it does. But there is that sensation of like nothing to do. And I just want to point out, because this is something I know a lot about, so I might as well actually bring it into the conversation. And it's a percolating passion project of mine. I don't know where it will lead. But so if nothing is separate, our psychological histories, our physiology, and our spiritual path are all the same thing. And so we have done entire episodes on the nervous system and the awakening nervous system. But I think it's important to say, because it's exciting, that the fields that pay attention to the responsiveness, the adaptability, the health, the flexibility of our autonomic nervous system, basically our nervous system's ability to even experience safety and basic trust, that the ways that we access that, first of all, that's a conversation at all in our culture is amazing. It really speaks volumes about the evolution of our species. And then that we're finding ways to repair the fact that for many of us, our nervous system experiences harm or no safety, no hope, all the time, both in the face of grave threat and no threat, that there are ways that we can rehabilitate the adaptability of our autonomic nervous system. And so I don't need to take us all the way down that road. I would say listen to our awakening nervous system episode. And if you go to the show notes, I'll put in, some important resources, particularly the work of Dr. Stephen Porges. So I don't want to make this overly cognitive, but all of this is to say that that conversation, like how do we repair our nervous system's ability to feel safe, is an important part of this. And that can be really relieving because, like you were saying, it's like, oh, in some ways just going, oh, I can't do this because I can't do this because I don't know how, because I don't have an experience of it, or I have very limited experiences of it. And there is assistance for this journey on a nervous system level, on a psychological level, and on a spiritual level, and on a physical level. And that when all these things come and play together, that's when we really get to feel held in a pretty robust container of support. So I want to bring up the nervous system piece, because for those of us so many of us, right, who have experienced significant ruptures in that capacity, we will wind up at a place in our spiritual path where awareness is really online and we're really aware. We're aware of the stories that the world holds and the stories that we hold. We're aware that we're operating through our conditioning and old ego patterns. We're aware of the lineage that we keep playing out, and we can't seem to stop. We can't seem to not keep doing it. So it's like we're watching the train wreck in slow motion all the time. And it's just like, well, this does not feel good to just keep watching it. And we will wind up at a place in our journey where, we could call that dark night of the soul, and where we just are circling. How do I get out of this? How do I experience trust? How do I experience safety? And it just is like a constant gnawing terror or despair in the system. So if you are one of those people who's going through that, there is assistance for this spiritually. We talk about it all the time here, and there's some teachers. All teachers are very adept at this. Some point directly at it, people like Jeannie Zandi. And then there's help for healthy nervous systems so that we don't keep, it's like looking for something that is so in a blind spot, and you're like, I know it's there. I know the ability to trust and surrender has got to be there somewhere. But if you have a big gaping blind spot in your system's ability to even see that, it can be pretty maddening.
Well, you haven't been on social media for the last month, so you wouldn't have seen this yet. But what's funny is I posted something about basic trust. I can't even remember what I posted. And on Facebook, one of our listeners was like, and I think this may relate to the nervous system. I'm like, yay, listeners, genius. So
yes,
do think so. Yes. I hadn't been thinking of it in that moment. And let's bring that into the conversation. And I would dare say everyone. So, okay, if you had big T trauma, your nervous system may really get inflamed into unsafety. But I would say anyone who's had a rupture has a nervous system that doesn't know how to rest.
Yeah,
right?
Anyone who's living in a culture of dualism, which is all of us.
Right. You think you have to do, as soon as ego thinks it has to do something, then it's already got the nervous system activity in a different way. And I remember Amoda Ma saying, in the Buddha at the gas pump interview, something to the effect of awakening implies a nervous system completely at rest.
Yeah.
And so if we're not awake, our nervous system is not completely at rest. That feels experientially true to me. Mm-hmm. And the more my nervous system has found safety, the more I'm with myself, the more I'm realized, the more I feel the benevolence and the love everywhere. And the further my nervous system's moved for that, the more I felt isolated, in pain, in agony, and cut off from everything. So clearly, the nervous system is relevant and can be supported and shouldn't really be left out, because why would we? We're here to awaken in these human bodies, and the bodies seem to have a relevancy around this. So I think it is a really good conversation. And I think ultimately, most of us could use to rehabilitate it. Because to me, trust has multiple angles. Like, I've had a few people say to me, I think I have this kind of trust. And I'm like, this basic trust he's talking about is like, it's of yourselves. He said, if you have basic trust, you don't even know you have basic trust because you didn't even know it was a thing.
Yes.
Like you never even thought about trust. Like, right. It's so cellular and ingrained. And most of us are kind of clawing at it. And then we may have trust in different things, like trust in our own ability. Mm-hmm. We may have trust in the fact that things seem to work out pretty good for us. But most of the time, that's conditional. So that if something was to happen that doesn't fit into that vision of how life operates, it can have our trust come crashing down. This kind of trust that we're referring to in this conversation is implicit and it's unconditional, which is why he can say, even when horrific things are happening,
right? It's unconditional.
Sense that there's some kind of rhyme or reason to things. I mean, you can almost think about, the story of Christ in the Bible, like about to get crucified, and he didn't want it. He was like, hey,
he wasn't feeling great about it.
No, like, hey, God, you could take this shit from me. I'd be super appreciative. But even with that, he had, or exemplified in these stories, a sense that, okay, this is what's meant to be. Right now, he was in touch with his soul. Mm-hmm. Right? He was in touch with the larger intelligence. It's part of why we call it Christ consciousness. Mm-hmm. So I thought, let's talk a little bit about how he thinks repair happens as well. And maybe we'll get to what stands in the way of it, or maybe that will be another conversation.
Yeah, we could always do a part 2.
Yeah, maybe that'll be a part 2.
This is deep, good, juicy stuff. So
yeah, it really is. I feel like we could explore it for a while in ourselves. So I'm going to paraphrase here how he thinks the path of repair can happen. And he didn't mention the nervous system. So we're adding that. He didn't mention that, though, of course, he thinks meditation and things like that could support the nervous system are really useful. But he didn't bring the body into it. So we can add that in our community. But what he did say, ultimately, as I got it anyway, was 2 things. So one was that you have to be aware of this lack of basic trust and the pain that it costs you. So that ultimately this lack of basic trust shows up in each of us in our own individual ways. Like, what does that mean that we do? Maybe we avoid conflict the rest of our lives. Maybe we identify as, the person who's in agony. Maybe we try to become the person who always pleases and gives to people. Like, there's all these manifestations of basic trust and of loss of basic trust. And underneath it, he calls them holes. And I don't know all of that information. Y'all can read him if you're interested in him. But that ultimately there's this pain and this longing for the kind of holding environment that you never got. Mm. Now, I remember being in therapy, and it was always easy to point the finger at my father for creating a lot of my distress, because he was the outwardly difficult one. He was angry, he was rageful, so it was always easy to say, oh, my dad, and to process through some of that early pain. And it was a while in before I even turned to look at my mother. Mm-hmm. And when I turned to look at my mother, it was a little bit about what she did and didn't do. But really what came up, and it was so vulnerable when it came up, was the desire for more from her. I could put the words more like protection, love, being seen. It was actually, I think the way I experienced it was just a yearning for her. That yearning for her was the most vulnerable thing I think I let myself experience in therapy, which is interesting. So longing, when you get to these fundamental places, like the longing for the holding container we didn't get, can feel to some of our minds useless. It can feel like a dead end road because there's no hope there. It can feel too painful to touch. I mean, and not all of this is conscious. We just won't even let ourselves acknowledge it. So one of the big things he says is you have to sooner or later, through the depth of your meditation and self-inquiry and processes, allow yourself to really acknowledge this deep, painful longing for what you didn't receive. Mm-hmm. Which was this kind of hope, right? So that's a big.
That shit is deep.
Yeah, that's deep. but it's in his perspective, and he's worked with thousands of people, and he's a pretty awake guy. Really interesting one too, because he's very cognitive. So he really likes to explore theory quite a bit. But in his view of working with thousands of people, if you can't acknowledge that, you'll never get at that core thing that's driving your identity project and your fixations and your rupture from connectivity.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one piece. The second piece, which is a little more tangible and workable, is we become aware of when the universe does have our back and of when things unfold for our benefit. So, Brooke, the story you shared to me had many elements of that. So part one is the obvious level. As you were getting this visual, as you were on this journey, you saw, oh, these things that were so painful that were experienced as a rupture with the universe or a rupture with God, whatever your word is, these things were bringing me closer to myself, closer to my soul, closer to feeling real and whole and deep and at one. So that's one way that trust repairs, is we start to experience the benevolence in all of these different forms, and we bring our awareness to it. Oh, so I thought, then the other thing is like, I thought this was going to go bad and it didn't, right? Like I thought that person who didn't return my text hated me. I was wrong. They love me. And so that reminds us, like it starts to plant a little seed, like, oh, maybe I can trust other people, right? And that's relative, but it's important. Even these relative moments are important. Or like your story, my intuition told me, go home, cancel your clients, and lay down. My fear told me, don't go canceling your clients. That's irresponsible as a business owner. You're going to lose all of your clients. You're going to be totally poor, and you're just going to be in a hole when you get to your house. Don't do it, right? I trusted my intuition. I went home. I laid down. I had this beautiful, profound moment of grace. My client stayed with me. I didn't go to the poorhouse. Everything turned out okay, right? And so as we keep tracking these moments, like I remember having many moments over the course of these years of meditating and being in psychotherapy where you go, oh, I surrendered and it was okay. Oh, I thought I was going to die when I got a divorce. I literally thought I was going to die. My mind was telling me you're going to fall on the floor and die. And I didn't. And actually I had quite a bit of resilience. I got through that heartbreak. I can handle life. I can be open because I can trust in my own resilience. And you watch that. You watch like, oh, I am different now. It's almost like as you had that vision, you saw like, oh my God, I've changed so much. I've deepened so much, right? Like, oh, change does happen. Oh, maybe this was for my higher good. Like every time you mark that with your awareness, it's like repairing trust with someone who betrayed you. On some level, and this is the part I think we can talk about next time, on some level, once there's that rupture, you feel betrayed by life.
And at war with God, furious with God. Maybe furious with God's the title of our next episode, which means, no, we'll never do it because I said that.
Yeah, way to go.
Damn it. The curse.
Or heartbroken by God or despairing, however it is. But you experience this kind of betrayal of life to you or betrayal of yourself to you, whichever one you're conscious of, whatever the case is. If someone betrays you in real life, they break your trust. How do you repair it? Slowly, lovingly for yourself, and with mindfulness. They did it different. They seemed different. It worked out okay. This is different than it used to be, right? And slowly over time, trust gets repaired. And it's the same with us in this case.
I just want to bring in one other category of thing, because one of the things I've noticed in myself is a bias. I have such a strong bias towards not bypassing and not being a bliss ninny and not expecting God to act like Santa Claus. And I love those things about myself, and I'm glad I get to be a voice for those. But I have such a strong bias towards them that I can sometimes not at all bring in just the delicious little joyful treats. Like there are treats. There are treats everywhere. And so there is also the category of you thought you really wanted one thing. It didn't go that way. And you actually got something way better. You know, like you mentioned your divorce. You're still very close friends with your ex-husband, Frank. Hi, Frank. We love you. You thought this has to work out forever and ever and ever. It didn't. It didn't go the way you really thought it has to be this way. And you were delivered a much more harmonious, satisfying, nourishing marriage. It's like, you know, I had just recently an idea. I have to move to this town. I have to buy a house in this town. This is how it has to go. And life just kept being like, nope, nope. And I was very persistent in not paying attention and being like, no, I'm going to keep trying. No, I made up my mind. No, it's going to work out. And then it landed me in a completely different town, different house, different neighborhood, way better. Just for whatever reason, I couldn't see that was in my best interest and my son's best interest and our lives' best interest. So there is a lot of that too, that we can see and also embrace, that we do actually get upgraded things from what our mind was so sure it needed to have happen.
Well, even what you're describing, I think relates to his discussion of trust and some of the things that are barriers to it. Because, you know, like you said, I don't know why, like I wasn't listening, but well, of course you weren't, because
I had decided it has to be this way.
Doing something wrong. It was like just not giving you a thing, right? And as opposed to, oh, well, I can trust if things aren't working in this way, it's for my highest good. Mm-hmm. It's like it's all perfectly baked into that conversation. And even when you were describing, feeling like, you know, you don't want to be a bliss ninny and all those things. So you can, well, apparently, to be continued, apparently this teacher would say, those are some of the barriers that develop from the rupture, is that we're like, well, I mean, I'm not going to just be a bliss ninny and be happy all the time because, you know, what would happen? I'm not going
to just receive joy. That seems disingenuous.
I'm not going to just focus on the positive. That's for suckers and that's going to get me killed, right? Like that's going to go real bad, right? Yeah. So all of these different things that happen in response to this rupture early on are some of these barriers and thoughts that come to us. Like, what am I, dumb? Like, yeah, I'm going to surrender 10%, but I'm not going to surrender 100% because I will be poor. I will be on the street. Right? So bless us all. Let's evoke our wonderful friend Jeannie Zandy. Mercy to the humans. This conversation's really meant to bring us all some context so that we can all keep walking this path with more clarity, right? It almost like focuses us more on how we can heal and what it looks like. And more understanding of why, you know, sometimes when you listen to spiritual teachers these days, like a lot of modern teachers will say, all of these aspirations they have, like in Buddhism or yoga, they have ways you should live. In like the modern non-dual paradigm, they'll talk about surrender, they'll talk about trust. And so there's all these different aspirations that different spiritual traditions have provided us. And modern teachers often say, no, those are a result of awakening, not the path to it.
Yes. I'm like,
that's
yes.
Really interesting, right? That's really interesting. And it's not to say don't try to be a good person, don't have morals, don't have a compass, but it is to say don't confuse that because the ego thinks, okay, I'm going to have these 10 commandments and I'm going to follow them and then I'll have heaven.
Yeah. If joyful for no reason is what awake looks like, I'm going to walk around with a big silly grin on my face and be the really super enthusiastic person. Like, no, that's just another mask.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
and it's
joyful for no reason totally exists.
Yeah. And it's not to say don't try. And it's not to say like drop the effort to live in integrity, because these things have their place and they are helpful. Like the more honest I am, the more I am being true to myself and the more I'm observing where I can't be, which helps me untie knots. I'm not trying to make any categorical do or don't do statement. All I'm inviting into the end of this conversation is that we can go easier on ourselves because these things that we often aspire to, they are a result of the reparation of this sense that we are cut off, isolated, not loved, not held, and not supported. They're a result of that. And as that heals, and it does heal progressively and over time, and if you're lucky enough for it to heal all in one shot, bless you. But usually gradually, and as it heals, we naturally recover this, and you'll find yourself surrendering a little more, trusting a little more, existing a little more, not striving a little more. Thanks for listening to today's show. The show notes, including all of the resources we mentioned, live on our website, blissandgrit.com. Our member platform, again, is at patreon.com/blissandgrit. And this is a place where you can not only donate to the show so that we can dedicate ourselves more full time to this, but you can also get really cool rewards for your support. If any of you have been wanting to engage with these topics or with Brooke and I in a deeper way, that's the place to go to ask questions and to have a more immersive experience. You can come play with us for free, though, on Instagram and Facebook, which is where we keep expanding the conversation after each episode, and you can find us there at Bliss and Grit. When you head over to the website, you can get our weekly digest by subscribing to our newsletter. You can find out about our swag, you can get more info on Patreon, and you can even locate our YouTube channel. And that's all at blissandgrit.com. I can't express to you how grateful we are just for you listening to today, for the reviews so many of you have written, and most especially for the patron support. It really means the world to us. Thank you all so much. Till next week.